That number is wrong. The words were soft, almost swallowed by the low hum of the projector, yet they cut through the 47th floor boardroom like a crack across glass. Every conversation stopped. Every chair seemed to freeze in place. At the head of the polished walnut table, Billionaire CEO Richard Whitmore held a silver pin just inches above a signature line worth $900 million. For a moment, nobody moved. The city skyline stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, glowing beneath a pale spring afternoon. But inside the room, the air felt suddenly heavy. Richard slowly lifted his eyes from the contract. "Who said that?" he asked. The executives exchanged confused glances. Attorneys looked over their tablets. A financial analyst adjusted his glasses. Then the room's attention drifted toward the doorway. Standing quietly beside the wall was a little girl. She couldn't have been older than 11. Her dark curls were tied back with a fading blue ribbon. She wore a simple yellow sweater, slightly oversized, and carried a notebook against her chest. Beside her sat a maintenance cart stocked with paper towels and cleaning supplies. She looked completely out of place among the tailored suits and luxury watches. "Aaliyah," whispered her mother, Denise Brooks, who had been replacing coffee cups near the back of the room. Her face immediately drained of color. "Sweetheart, come here." But Aaliyah didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the projection screen at the front of the room. "The number on the revenue forecast is wrong," she repeated. A few executives chuckled under their breath. One attorney leaned back in his chair and smirked. Richard's chief financial officer, Grant Keller, let out a short laugh. "Sir," he said, glancing toward Richard, "I think we've reached the stage of the meeting where children are auditing Wall Street." More laughter followed. Denise hurried forward, embarrassment flooding her face. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Whitmore." She didn't mean to interrupt. "I'll take her out right now." Aaliyah tightened her grip on the notebook. "I'm not trying to interrupt," she said quietly. "I just noticed something." Grant shook his head. "Noticed what exactly?" The projector light reflected in Aaliyah's eyes as she pointed toward the giant screen displaying quarterly projections. The fourth quarter revenue total. The room fell silent again. "It doesn't match the numbers above it." Grant crossed his arms. "And how would you know that?" Aaliyah looked at the screen one more time. "Because I added them twice." A few people exchanged amused looks. Richard remained expressionless, but he had not lowered his gaze from the girl. Something about her certainty felt different. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't seeking attention. She simply sounded sure. Outside, sunlight glimmered against the glass towers of Manhattan. Inside, nobody seemed to remember breathing. Aaliyah slowly opened her notebook. Several pages were covered with handwritten calculations. Neat columns, tiny figures, careful arithmetic. She looked back at the projection and then at the billionaire. "If I'm right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that company isn't worth what everyone thinks it is." Aaliyah's words lingered in the room long after she stopped speaking. Nobody laughed now. The giant screen at the front of the boardroom continued to glow with rows of numbers, percentages, and projections, but suddenly those figures seemed less certain than they had a minute earlier. Richard Whitmore slowly set his pen on the table. The soft click echoed louder than it should have. Across the room, Denise Brooks felt her stomach tighten. She knew that look on her daughter's face. It was the same expression Aaliyah wore whenever she solved a difficult math problem before anyone else in class. Calm, focused, certain. The problem was that this was not a classroom. This was Whitmore Capital, one of the largest investment firms in the country. Denise stepped closer to her daughter. "Aaliyah, sweetheart, that is enough." But Aaliyah only glanced at her mother before looking back at the screen. "The total says $682 million, she said quietly. "But when I added the quarterly numbers, I got $635 million. Grant Keller leaned forward in his chair. His smile had disappeared. "You calculated all of that from across the room?" Aaliyah nodded. I could see the screen reflected in the glass outside. A few executives turned toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The reflection was faint, but visible. Richard followed her gaze. Then he looked back at the notebook in her hands. "May I see it?" The request surprised everyone. Denise looked shocked. Grant looked irritated. Aaliyah hesitated for only a second before walking toward the table. The boardroom suddenly felt enormous around her. Leather chairs towered above her shoulders. Expensive watches flashed beneath the ceiling lights. Yet she kept walking until she reached the end of the table and handed the notebook to Richard. He opened it carefully. Every page contained numbers, long columns of calculations, revenue estimates, ratios, multiplication tables, small notes written neatly in the margins. Richard flipped through several pages in silence. "You did all of this yourself?" he asked. "Yes, sir. For school." Aaliyah shook her head. "Mostly for fun." A few executives exchanged looks. Richard continued turning pages. Then he stopped. One sheet contained handwritten notes copied from a business article. Another showed calculations involving stock performance. None of it looked like the work of an average 11-year-old. Denise lowered her eyes. She knew exactly where those pages came from. Public libraries, free online courses, old finance magazines left behind in waiting rooms. Aaliyah absorbed information the way other children watch television. Grant cleared his throat. "Sir, with respect, we are delaying a major acquisition because of arithmetic from a child." Richard looked up, then verifying it should not take long. The room fell quiet again. An analyst near the center of the table opened a spreadsheet on his laptop. Fingers moved across keys. Numbers appeared. Columns shifted. Seconds passed. Then another analyst started checking independently. The silence grew heavier with every click. Finally, one of the analysts stopped typing. His face lost color. He looked toward Richard, then toward Grant. "Sir," he said carefully, "the total on the presentation does not reconcile with the source data." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Aaliyah stood beside her mother, holding her breath. Richard Whitmore slowly leaned back in his chair. Outside the windows, helicopters crossed the Manhattan skyline. Inside the boardroom, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars suddenly felt balanced on the edge of a single number. The analyst's words settled over the boardroom like a winter frost. Nobody reached for a coffee cup. Nobody checked a phone. The confidence that had filled the room less than 10 minutes earlier seemed to have vanished. Richard Whitmore remained still, his eyes fixed on the spreadsheet projected across the wall. Beside him, two additional analysts had already begun reviewing the source files independently. The clicking of keyboards became the only sound in the room. Grant Keller adjusted his tie. "There is probably a formatting issue somewhere," he said. His voice was calm, but not as calm as before. "These reports pass through multiple departments." One analyst looked up. "The issue is not formatting." Another voice followed. "The revenue figure appears to include the same asset category more than once." Grant immediately shook his head. "That is impossible." Yet nobody sounded convinced. Richard folded his hands on the table. The billionaire had built his reputation by noticing details other people missed. It was why investors trusted him. It was why competitors feared him. And now a little girl standing beside a maintenance cart had spotted something his entire executive team had overlooked. He did not like that feeling. Across the room, Denise quietly placed a hand on Aaliyah's shoulder. She wanted to leave. Every instinct told her they did not belong here. Yet Richard had not asked them to go. Aaliyah stood silently, watching the numbers change on the screen as analysts opened hidden worksheets and supporting documents. The figures fascinated her. They always had. Numbers felt honest. They either worked or they did not. There was comfort in that. 20 minutes earlier, she had been sitting outside the conference room doing algebra problems while waiting for her mother to finish work. Now some of the most powerful people in New York were examining calculations she had written in a notebook purchased for $3 at a discount store. The contrast felt unreal. One of the attorneys leaned toward Richard. "Sir, perhaps we should postpone the signing until verification is complete." Richard did not answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the skyline beyond the glass. Afternoon sunlight reflected from neighboring towers, casting silver streaks across the room. Finally he spoke. "How large is the discrepancy?" A senior analyst swallowed. $47 million. Several executives visibly stiffened. The number was not catastrophic for a corporation of this size, but it was far too large to ignore. Richard's jaw tightened. "And the source?" The analyst hesitated. More typing followed. Another worksheet opened. Then another. The deeper they looked, the quieter the room became. A woman from the audit department suddenly leaned forward. "Sir," she said carefully, "the duplicate entries all originate from the same reporting chain." Richard turned toward her. "Which department?" The answer took only a second. "Office of the Chief Financial Officer." For the first time that afternoon, all eyes moved toward Grant Keller. The sunlight that had seemed warm moments earlier now felt cold against the glass. Grant forced a smile. There must be some misunderstanding. But nobody laughed. Nobody nodded. And standing quietly beside her mother, Aaliyah noticed something she had not seen before. For the first time since she entered the room, Grant Keller looked nervous. Grant Keller felt every eye in the room settle on him. The attention was subtle, almost polite, but it carried a weight that no executive could ignore. He loosened his posture and forced a confident smile. "Richard, we are talking about preliminary reporting data," he said. "There are always adjustments before a final transaction closes." Richard Whitmore did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the audit director. "Can adjustments explain duplicate revenue entries?" The woman glanced at her screen. "Not these entries." The answer landed heavily. Across the table, several board members began, quietly reviewing printed reports that had been sitting untouched for most of the meeting. Pages turned. Pens tapped against paper. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as a routine acquisition now felt like an investigation. Grant leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, we should not jump to conclusions because of a spreadsheet discrepancy." Aaliyah noticed something curious. Grant kept calling it a discrepancy. Nobody else was using that word anymore. The analysts were calling it a duplication. The auditors were calling it a reporting error. Yet Grant continued, choosing the smallest possible description. Richard seemed to notice it too. The billionaire folded his hands. "Then let us remove conclusions and focus on facts." Another analyst cleared his throat. "We found something else." Every head turned. The young analyst looked uncomfortable. The duplicated revenue entries increased valuation by almost 8%. Silence followed. Even the air conditioning seemed louder. 8%. On a transaction this size, that number represented tens of millions of dollars. Richard's expression hardened. "Keep going." The analyst swallowed. "The adjustments were introduced 3 months ago during a revision cycle." He clicked another screen onto the projector. A timeline appeared. Dates, reports, approval signatures, review checkpoints. Then one name appeared repeatedly beside the revisions. Grant Keller. Nobody spoke. Grant looked at the screen and immediately shook his head. "Those approvals passed through multiple departments." "But they originated from your office," the audit director replied. Grant opened his mouth, then closed it again. Near the back of the room, Denise felt her heart racing. She had spent years cleaning offices after executives went home. She understood power. Usually the people sitting at this table controlled every conversation. Yet now nobody seemed fully in control. Aaliyah stood quietly beside her. The notebook remained tucked under her arm. She had never imagined her afternoon would unfold like this. Richard slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the windows. Manhattan stretched beneath him in every direction. Yellow. Taxis crawled through the streets far below. Ferries crossed the Hudson River in the distance. Normally that view helped him think. Today it only sharpened one question. How had a child seen what experienced professionals had missed? Behind him, another notification appeared on the projector screen. One of the auditors had opened an archived email trail. The room collectively leaned forward. Richard turned around. The audit director looked at the newly displayed message, then lifted her eyes. "Sir," she said carefully, "I believe we need to review every financial revision connected to this transaction before proceeding any further." No one objected. Not a single person. And for the first time all afternoon, Grant Keller lowered his eyes from the screen. The boardroom remained frozen long after the last email appeared on the screen. What had once looked like a simple reporting issue was beginning to reveal a deeper pattern. The audit team worked quietly, opening files that had not been reviewed in months. Spreadsheet after spreadsheet filled the projection wall. Timestamps appeared. Approval records surfaced. Revision histories unfolded one layer at a time. Richard Whitmore returned to his chair, but he did not sit immediately. He stood beside it, staring at the growing collection of documents. Years of experience had taught him that numbers often told stories people tried to hide. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was how far it went. Across the room, Grant Keller maintained a composed expression, but the confidence that had once defined him seemed to be fading. His answers became shorter. His explanations became less certain. Every new document seemed to create another question. One of the auditors finally broke the silence. "We located the first adjustment." Her voice was calm but firm. She highlighted a line item on the screen. This entry increased projected revenue by $12 million. Another auditor added, and this one added $9 million. A third voice followed. This adjustment added $6 million. Richard narrowed his eyes. The pattern was becoming obvious. Individually, the changes appeared small. Together, they transformed the value of the acquisition target. Denise stood quietly near the back wall. She had spent years cleaning conference rooms after meetings ended. She had seen executives celebrate victories and argue over contracts. Never once had she imagined standing inside a meeting like this. Even more unbelievable was the fact that her daughter had become the reason it was happening. Beside her, Aaliyah remained silent. She watched the screen with the same focus she used when solving puzzles at home. To her, the numbers still felt simpler than the adults discussing them. They either matched or they did not. They either made sense or they did not. One of the board members leaned forward. How many revisions are connected to the same approval chain? The audit director checked her notes. 23. A murmur moved through the room. 23 separate revisions. 23 opportunities for someone to notice. 23 opportunities that had somehow passed without challenge. Richard finally sat down. The leather chair creaked softly beneath him. Continue. More records appeared. More signatures. More approvals. Then the room went silent again. An analyst had discovered something new. His eyes widened as he reviewed the file in front of him. Sir, he said carefully, there is another issue. Richard looked up immediately. What is it? The analyst turned his monitor toward the audit team. Several of these adjustments were submitted after internal reviews had already been completed. The statement landed heavily. That was not normal procedure. The audit director examined the evidence for herself. Her expression hardened. He is correct. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Sunlight had begun fading beyond the windows, casting long shadows across the conference table. The city outside continued moving as if nothing had changed. Inside the room, everything had changed. Richard slowly turned his gaze toward Grant Keller. This time, Grant did not meet his eyes. And in that quiet moment, everyone in the boardroom understood that the investigation was only beginning. The pace of the investigation slowed as evening settled over Manhattan. The bright afternoon glow had faded into deep shades of blue beyond the windows, and the city lights below began to flicker awake one building at a time. Inside the boardroom, the tension remained, but the energy had changed. The rush of discovery had given way to something quieter, more deliberate, more reflective. Richard Whitmore sat alone at the far end of the table while auditors continued their review in an adjacent conference room. The giant projection screen had gone dark. The stacks of reports remained scattered across the polished wood surface like pieces of a puzzle that nobody could ignore anymore. Near the doorway, Denise Brooks gathered a few empty coffee cups into a tray. Her shift had technically ended hours ago, yet she had stayed because she did not know what else to do. Everything felt unreal. Aaliyah sat beside the window with her notebook resting on her lap. For the first time all day, she was not studying numbers. She was simply watching the city. Tiny streams of headlights moved through the streets below like rivers of light. Ferries crossed the dark water. Office workers headed home. The world continued moving. Richard looked toward the girl. The room was quiet enough that he could hear the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. "Do you always carry that notebook?" he asked. Aaliyah looked down at it and nodded. "Mostly." "Why?" She thought for a moment. "Because numbers make sense when other things do not." Richard considered the answer. It sounded far older than 11 years. Across the room, Denise paused. She knew exactly what her daughter meant. Life had not always been easy. Bills arrived whether people were ready or not. Opportunities often seemed reserved for others. Yet numbers followed rules. They did not care where someone lived. They did not care what job their parents had. Richard slowly leaned back in his chair. For years he had trusted expertise, titles, and credentials. Those things had built an empire. Yet today, a child with a discount store notebook had protected that empire better than some of the professionals sitting at his table. The realization was uncomfortable. It was also impossible to ignore. The door opened. Quietly, the audit director stepped inside carrying a folder. She did not speak immediately. Instead, she placed the folder on the table and looked toward Richard. Her expression revealed enough. The findings were serious. But for a brief moment, Richard did not open the folder. His attention remained on Aaliyah. She sat peacefully by the glass, her reflection blending with the lights of the city beyond. There was no pride in her expression, no expectation of reward, no desire for recognition. She had simply seen something wrong and spoken up. Richard realized that was the part he admired most. Not the intelligence, not the calculations, the courage, the willingness to tell the truth in a room full of people who might not want to hear it. And as the first stars appeared above the skyline, an unusual silence settled over the boardroom. It was no longer the silence of confusion or suspicion. It was the silence that comes when people begin to understand the true value of honesty. The audit director finally opened the folder she had carried into the boardroom and slid several documents across the table. The pages were marked with highlighted entries, approval trails, and internal review notes. Richard Whitmore studied them in silence. Every minute seemed to confirm what the investigation had been suggesting for hours. The duplicate revenue entries had not appeared by accident. They had been inserted gradually, hidden beneath routine revisions, then approved through a chain that led back to the same office again and again. The room remained still as Richard finished reading the final page. He placed the folder down carefully. No dramatic gesture, no raised voice, just a quiet certainty that changed everything. "How much?" he asked. The audit director checked her summary report. The inflated valuation exceeds $47 million. If the acquisition had been approved tonight, shareholders would have been exposed to significant financial risk. Richard nodded once. The answer did not surprise him anymore. What surprised him was how close the company had come to making the mistake. Around the table, board members exchanged uneasy looks. Some had reviewed these reports personally. Others had trusted the process. None of them had seen what an 11-year-old girl had spotted in seconds. Grant Keller remained seated near the center of the room. The confidence that once defined him had completely disappeared. His shoulders seemed smaller now. The polished certainty that made him one of the firm's most respected executives had been replaced by silence. Richard looked toward him. "Was there anything else you wanted to explain?" Grant stared at the table for several moments. The city lights reflected faintly across the polished wood surface. Finally, he exhaled. The pressure kept growing. Nobody interrupted. Investors wanted stronger numbers. The acquisition target wanted a higher valuation. Every quarter, there were expectations. His voice sounded tired. Older somehow. At first it was temporary. Small adjustments. I convinced myself the real performance would eventually catch up. The room listened quietly. Richard did not react. Neither did the auditors. Grant looked down at his hands. Then the adjustments became harder to reverse. Another silence followed. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of realization. The truth had finally arrived. Across the room, Aaliyah watched without saying a word. She had never imagined that a single incorrect number could lead to something this large. Yet she understood one thing clearly. The problem had not started with mathematics. It had started with choices. Richard slowly stood and walked toward the window. The skyline shimmered beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched toward the horizon. Behind him, decades of experience, advanced degrees, and executive titles sat around the conference table. Yet none of those things had protected the company today. Honesty had. A quiet voice willing to speak when everyone else assumed everything was fine. Richard turned back toward the room. His gaze moved past the executives, past the auditors, and settled on Aaliyah. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the billionaire gave a slow nod. It was not directed toward the reports. It was not directed toward the auditors. It was directed toward the little girl by the window. And in that simple gesture, everyone in the room understood exactly who had changed the outcome of the day. The boardroom felt different after that. The tension that had dominated the afternoon slowly gave way to reflection. The auditors continued organizing documents. Board members quietly reviewed final summaries, and the acquisition that had nearly been approved was officially suspended pending a full review. Yet none of those developments seemed to hold the room's attention for long. People kept glancing toward the same place, toward the window where Aaliyah sat with her notebook resting on her knees. Richard Whitmore eventually stepped away from the conference table and walked across the room. His polished shoes moved softly over the carpet. Conversations faded as he approached. Denise immediately straightened, unsure what would happen next. Years of experience had taught her that powerful people rarely crossed a room to speak with employees like her. Richard stopped a few feet from them. For a moment, he simply looked at the notebook in Aaliyah's hands. The cover was worn. Several corners had been repaired with clear tape. Pages inside were packed with equations, notes, and observations written in careful pencil. It was not the kind of thing most people would notice. Today, it was impossible to overlook. "How long have you been studying finance?" he asked gently. Aaliyah shrugged. "I just like learning." Richard smiled faintly. It was perhaps the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. Most people spend years learning what you noticed in a few minutes. Aaliyah looked down. "I only saw a number that did not fit." The simplicity of the answer caused several people nearby to exchange quiet smiles. There was no arrogance in her voice, no attempt to impress anyone. She truly believed she had done something ordinary. Richard glanced toward Denise. "You should be very proud of her." Denise felt emotion rise in her chest. For a second, she could not find words. She had worked nights, weekends, holidays, and every extra shift she could find. She had worried constantly about bills, school supplies, and opportunities her daughter might never receive. Hearing those words from one of the most influential men in the country felt almost unreal. "I already was," she replied softly. Richard nodded. Then he reached into his suit pocket and removed a business card. He placed it carefully on top of Aaliyah's notebook. "When you are older, if you still love numbers this much, call me." Aaliyah looked at the card, then back at him. "Really? Really?" Around the room, several executives watched the exchange in silence. Earlier that afternoon, some of them had laughed when she spoke. Now nobody seemed eager to speak at all. The contrast was impossible to miss. Richard looked around the boardroom one final time. The reports, the spreadsheets, the executives, the city beyond the glass. Then his eyes returned to Aaliyah. "Today you reminded all of us of something important," he said. "The truth does not become less valuable because of who says it." The room fell quiet once more. But this time the silence felt warm, respectful. And for the first time since entering the building that morning, Denise Brooks allowed herself to believe that her daughter's future might be bigger than either of them had ever imagined. Nearly an hour later, the boardroom finally began to empty. The auditors carried their folders. The attorneys gathered their notes. The executives left more quietly than they had arrived. Outside, Manhattan shimmered beneath a blanket of city lights, each window glowing against the dark sky like 1,000 distant stars. Denise Brooks stood near the doorway with her coat folded over one arm, while Aaliyah carefully slipped her notebook into her backpack. The business card Richard Whitmore had given her rested safely between the pages. Nobody rushed them. Nobody asked them to leave. For the first time all day, there was nothing left to prove. Richard remained near the window after everyone else had gone. His reflection stretched across the glass beside the skyline. The acquisition had been stopped. The investigation would continue. Difficult conversations awaited in the days ahead. Yet one thought stayed with him more than any financial report. A little girl had walked into a room filled with experts and chosen honesty over silence. That single decision had changed everything. Denise gently touched Aaliyah's shoulder. "Ready to go home?" Aaliyah nodded. Together they walked toward the elevator lobby. Their footsteps echoed softly through the marble hallway. The building felt different now. Earlier that morning, Denise had entered through the service entrance as she always did, unnoticed among hundreds of employees. Tonight she walked out holding her head a little higher. Not because anyone had given her something. Because someone had finally seen what had always been there. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. Aaliyah stepped inside and turned back for one last look down the hallway. Through the glass walls of the boardroom, she could still see the large projection screen. The numbers had been removed. The charts were gone. The room was empty. Yet she remembered the single figure that had started it all. One number that did not belong. One detail everyone else had missed. The doors slowly closed. Down below, the streets buzzed with evening traffic. A cold breeze drifted between the towers as Denise and Aaliyah emerged onto the sidewalk. Yellow taxi lights reflected across the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a ferry horn echoed across the river. The city sounded exactly the same as it had that morning. But for them, something had changed. High above, Richard watched from the 47th floor until the two figures disappeared into the crowd. Then he looked down at the conference table one final time. In the center sat a small sheet of paper covered with pencil calculations. Aaliyah had forgotten one of her practice pages. Richard picked it up carefully. Rows of numbers filled the page. At the bottom, written in small handwriting, was a simple sentence. Check everything twice. The truth is worth the extra time. Richard smiled quietly. Beyond the glass, the city lights continued shining. Inside the boardroom, the silence felt warm. Not the silence of power, not the silence of fear, the silence of a lesson finally learned.